The map was burning. Alma Yates stood in the center of Benjamin Underwood's ranch house, holding the charred edges of 6 months of her life's work between her trembling fingers, and all she could think was that she had been an absolute fool. The flames in the fireplace behind her crackled and spat as if celebrating the destruction, and the man standing across the room from her, broad-shouldered, jaw set like iron, eyes the color of a storm rolling in off the plains, looked like he was either going to say something that would save them both or destroy whatever remained of what they'd built together. "You knew," she said, and her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. She had survived cholera on the Missouri River, a stagecoach robbery outside of Dodge City, and 3 years of men in government offices telling her that women could not hold cartographic commissions. She would not let her voice shake for a rancher in Colorado, no matter how deeply he had embedded himself into the chambers of her heart. "You knew the whole time why they hired me. You knew what they were planning to do with my maps." Benjamin Underwood did not look away. That was the thing about him that had undone her from the very beginning. He never looked away from hard things. He looked directly at her now, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face, and when he opened his mouth, the words that came out were not the denial she had been half hoping for, half dreading. "I found out 3 weeks ago," he said, "and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you every single day since then without watching everything fall apart." Everything had already fallen apart. Alma set what remained of her maps on the oak table beside her, the surveys she had completed, the land grids she had drafted with meticulous precision across hundreds of miles of Colorado territory, and she pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed. Because she needed to breathe before she could say the next thing, and the next thing mattered enormously. "Those maps," she said quietly, "were going to be used by the railroad consortium to displace every rancher and homesteader in this valley, including you, including every family between here and the San Juan Mountains." "I know," Benjamin said, "and you didn't tell me." "I know," he said again, and this time his voice had something in it that she had never heard from him before. Something raw and helpless and desperate. "Alma, I'm telling you now." She looked at him across the distance of that room, across the ruins of her professional life, and the complicated architecture of whatever had been growing between them since the first morning. She had ridden onto the Underwood ranch with her leather satchel full of instruments and her commission letter from the Territorial Survey Office. And she thought about how she had arrived in this wild, wind-scoured corner of the Colorado Territory, not knowing a single soul, not knowing what she was truly being sent to accomplish, not knowing that the rancher with the complicated eyes and the quiet way of moving through the world would one day look at her as if she were the most important fixed point on any map he had ever tried to read. She thought about where it had all begun. It was March of 1878 when the stagecoach from Pueblo deposited Alma Yates at the edge of what the locals called Harrow Valley, a wide, sweeping basin of grassland and sage that sat cradled between red sandstone ridges to the east and the distant purple suggestion of the San Juan Mountains to the west. She had been 27 years old, recently released from a 2-year contract with the United States Geological Survey in Washington, carrying a commission from the newly formed Colorado Territorial Survey Office that she had fought tooth and nail to secure. The commission letter was signed by a man named Harold Prout, who served as regional director, and it authorized her to conduct a comprehensive survey of all land parcels, water rights, and geographical features in the Harrow Valley district. She had been told it was for the purposes of territorial record-keeping. She had believed that because she had wanted to believe it, and because she was a cartographer of exceptional skill who had spent 3 years being overlooked and underpaid in Washington and had jumped at the opportunity to do real field work in the West. She had believed it the way people believe things that come wrapped in official letterhead and offer them exactly what they most desire. The stagecoach driver had been a laconic man named Pete who deposited her trunk on the dirt road with considerably less ceremony than she'd hoped for and pointed at a collection of buildings perhaps a half-mile down the valley road. "That's Harrow," he said. "Population 43, give or take. Hotel's the white building. Saloon's next door. Don't confuse them." Alma had looked out at the vast, open country around her, the enormous sky, the smell of sage and cold earth, the silence that pressed against the ears in a way that felt both terrifying and magnificent, and she had felt something unlock in her chest that had been bolted shut for years. She had also been robbed twice on the way here, once in Kansas City and once outside Pueblo. She had lost her spare theodolite and her better pair of boots, but she had kept her field notebooks and her compass and her drafting instruments, which were the things that actually mattered. She settled into Harrow at the boarding house run by a widow named Margaret Finch, who was 62 years old, sharp as a tack, and deeply suspicious of anyone who arrived alone and on purpose. "Most women who come here alone came because they had no other choice," Margaret told her over supper on her first evening, serving her salt pork and cornbread with the efficiency of someone who did not believe in wasting food or words. "What's your story?" "I'm a cartographer," Alma said. "I'm here to survey the valley." Margaret had given her a look that contained more information than most people conveyed in an hour of conversation. "You be careful, Miss Yates," she said. "There are people in this valley who don't want to be surveyed." Alma had thought she understood what that meant. She had thought it meant the usual territorial friction ranchers who didn't want their fence lines documented, homesteaders who had built on land they didn't legally hold, the ordinary human resistance to being counted and measured and recorded. She had not understood yet how much more complicated it was than that. Her first encounter with Benjamin Underwood happened on her 4th day in the valley, when she rode out to the eastern ridge to take her initial compass readings and set her first survey marker. She had hired a horse from the livery stable, a steady roan mare named Agnes who had clearly survived considerable turbulence in her life and was not impressed by much of anything, and she had ridden out in the early morning light with her equipment pack strapped across the saddlebag and her field notebook tucked into her jacket. She was in the middle of taking a bearing with her Brunton compass when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned, and there he was. Benjamin Underwood was riding a dark bay horse and looking at her with an expression that she would come to recognize as his version of complete bafflement, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a tension in the jaw, the look of a man who has encountered something the landscape has failed to prepare him for. He was perhaps 30 years old, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, practical build that came from actual labor rather than pretense. His hat was dark brown and his coat was the color of dust, and he sat his horse with the unconscious ease of someone who had been doing it his entire life. "You are on my land," he said, not aggressively, just as a statement of fact. "I'm aware," Alma said, not looking up from her compass. "I have a territorial commission. I'm authorized to access all land parcels within the survey district." There was a pause. "That's the Underwood Ranch," he said. "I know," she said. She wrote down her bearing. "Your eastern boundary runs to the ridgeline. I need to establish a reference point here before I can begin the lower valley grids." Another pause. She finally looked up at him. He was studying her with an attention that was not rude exactly, but was completely unguarded, the way a person looks at something genuinely unexpected, as if the frontier had presented him with a puzzle he hadn't anticipated. "Benjamin Underwood," he said. "Alma Yates," she said. "Territorial Survey Office." He nodded slowly. "How long is this survey going to take?" "Probably 6 months," she said. "Maybe 7, depending on weather and access conditions." He looked out over his land, the wide sweep of grassland and the cattle in the middle distance and the ridge above them, and then back at her. "I'll have one of my men ride with you when you're on the ranch property, for safety." "That won't be necessary," she said. "Miss Yates," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite seriousness, but something precisely between the two. "I don't say it because I think you can't handle yourself. I say it because 2 weeks ago, we had a mountain lion take a calf 50 yards from where you're standing. And because 3 of the survey markers someone set out here last autumn were pulled up by parties unknown. This isn't the easiest country. Alma had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had looked at the red sandstone ridgeline, the vast and indifferent landscape around them, the mile of open grass between here and Harrow. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He had ridden back down the slope without another word, and she had watched him go and felt something that she resolutely declined to name. The man he sent to ride with her for the first 2 weeks was called Everett, a ranch hand in his 40s, quiet, competent, and clearly under orders not to interfere with her work. He mostly watched the ridgelines while she took her measurements, which she found she was grateful for, even though she would not have admitted it. But it was Benjamin himself who showed up on the 3rd week. She was working along the creek that crossed the western portion of the ranch, trying to establish the water right boundaries that had apparently been disputed for a decade, when she heard the familiar sound of his horse and looked up to find him dismounting beside her. "Everett's got a sick calf to manage," he said, "so you get me today." "I don't need a chaperone," she said automatically. "Good," he said, "because I'm not one. I'm just a man with nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning." He looked at the survey equipment she had spread across the creek bank. "What are you measuring?" She hesitated, then explained the process. The way she was triangulating the creek's course against her established reference points, building a precise picture of the waterway's path through the valley so that it could be accurately rendered on the final survey maps. He listened without interrupting, which she found unusual. Men in positions of authority, and ranchers were certainly men in positions of authority on their own land, typically either dismissed what she was doing as incomprehensible or tried to explain it back to her incorrectly. Benjamin Underwood did neither. He asked 2 questions, both of which were genuinely intelligent, and then he sat on a rock by the creek and watched her work in a silence that felt surprisingly like company. "You've done this a long time," he said eventually. "Since I was 20, she said. "I apprenticed under a surveyor in Philadelphia, then I went to work for the USGS. "Long way from Philadelphia," he said. "Yes," she said. "Did you want to come out here or did they send you?" She considered the question. "Both," she said finally. "They offered it. I accepted because I wanted to. The West is the most cartographically interesting territory in the country right now. Everything is still being named and measured. It matters who does the measuring." He had looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, something thoughtful and serious and a little startled, as if she had said something he hadn't expected to mean something to him but did. "It does matter," he said quietly, "more than most people realize." That day stretched into the afternoon. She worked, and he watched the ridge, and somewhere around midday, he produced a cloth-wrapped bundle from his saddlebag that turned out to contain cold biscuits and dried venison, which he offered without ceremony, and which she accepted with equal pragmatism because she was hungry and had forgotten to eat, which was a habit she'd had since childhood and had never managed to cure. They ate sitting on opposite sides of the creek, and he told her about the ranch, that he'd come out to Colorado from Tennessee in 1872, that he'd spent 2 years working other men's cattle before he'd scraped together enough money to buy the first 200 acres of what was now the Underwood Ranch, that he'd built most of the structures on the property himself with help from 2 hired men. He told her about the valley, about the way the water ran in spring and where the best grazing was in summer, and where the snow collected deepest in winter, and which ridges gave shelter, and which ones funneled the wind straight into everything in their path. He talked about the land the way she thought about maps, as a living document that required constant reading, constant interpretation, a system of signs and meanings that revealed itself only to those patient enough to keep looking. She realized, somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, that she was no longer just listening out of politeness. She was listening because she didn't want him to stop. Over the following weeks, Benjamin appeared regularly at whatever section of the ranch she was surveying, sometimes with Everett and sometimes alone. The pretense of supervision faded quickly and naturally, because it became obvious that what was actually happening was something neither of them had quite planned for. They were talking, really talking, the kind of conversation that doesn't follow a social script, that takes unexpected turns and circles back on itself, and occasionally lands on a thought that neither person has ever said aloud before and finds, to mutual surprise, that it holds up to scrutiny. He had been married once, he told her, in the quiet way people tell you important things when they've decided to trust you. Her name was Caroline, and she had died in the influenza outbreak of 1875, 3 years after they'd come out west together. She had been 24 years old, and she had loved the mountains and hated the winters and planted a kitchen garden every spring with a determination that the alkaline Colorado soil had consistently failed to reward. "I kept the garden going for 2 years after," he said. "Nothing grew, but I kept trying." Alma had felt something happen in her chest at that image, this large, capable, solitary man bent over a stubbornly barren garden trying. "Did it ever grow?" she asked. "Third year," he said. "Tomatoes, not many but some." She told him about Philadelphia, about her father, who had been a ship's navigator and had taught her to read charts before she could read words, who had died when she was 16, and left her with a complete set of surveying instruments and an absolute conviction that understanding where you were in the world was one of the most important things a person could do. She told him about the years of being the only woman in every professional room she entered, about the particular exhaustion of having to be twice as precise and 3 times as certain just to be taken halfway seriously, about the commission in Washington that she'd held for 3 years and lost when the department reorganized and decided they could not justify the irregularity of a female cartographer, which was the polite institutional way of saying they had run out of excuses to pay her what they owed her. She did not tell him all of this at once. It came out in pieces, the way real things do, a detail here, a clarification there, the story assembling itself across a dozen conversations over several weeks. And what she noticed, through all of it, was that Benjamin Underwood listened to her the way he had listened to her explain the survey process on that first day. Completely, without interruption, with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what she had to say rather than merely waiting for his own turn to speak. It was, she thought, one of the most uncommon things she had ever encountered in a person. She was 3 months into the survey by the time the complications began to surface. The first sign was a conversation she overheard at Margaret Finch's boarding house between 2 men she didn't recognize, who were talking quietly in the hallway outside the dining room about the Valley acquisition and the right-of-way determinations, in a way that made her slow her steps and press herself against the wall to listen. She caught only fragments mentions of the Pacific Southern Railroad Consortium, a name she didn't recognize at first, Caldwell. And then, once the survey is finished, they'll have everything they need to file the federal claim. She walked into the dining room with her pulse beating in her throat and her supper bowl feeling very heavy in her hands. Federal claim, right-of-way, railroad land grants. She sat down across from Margaret Finch and said carefully, "What do you know about the Pacific Southern Railroad?" Margaret had set down her fork and given her that complicated look again. "I know they've been trying to put a line through this valley for 2 years," she said. "I know the consortium that backs them has friends in the Territorial Survey Office." Alma's supper sat untouched. "Harold Prout," Margaret said, "the man who signed your commission. His brother-in-law sits on the Pacific Southern Board." The world had a way of rearranging itself around certain pieces of information. Alma sat very still and let the rearrangement happen. She had been sent here to survey the valley. Her maps, her precise, meticulous, legally authoritative maps, would serve as the documentary foundation for a railroad land grant claim that would allow the Pacific Southern Consortium to seize right-of-way through the entire valley under federal railroad land grant law. The ranchers and homesteaders whose land she was mapping would be displaced. Their land would be condemned. Their water rights would be absorbed into the railroad's claim. She had been used. She had been brought here as a tool, and she had been too hungry for the work, too grateful for the commission, too eager to finally be given a real assignment in real country, to ask the questions she should have asked. She walked out to the Underwood ranch the next morning before breakfast, alone, without her equipment, which was the clearest possible signal that this was not a professional visit. Benjamin was in the yard when she arrived, mid-conversation with Everett about fence posts, and when he saw her expression he said something quiet to Everett and walked toward her. "What happened?" he said. She told him what she'd learned. She watched his face as she spoke, looking for the thing that Margaret's words had made her afraid to look for, the sign that he already knew, that she had not just been betrayed by Harold Prout and the Pacific Southern Consortium, but by this man as well, the man who had spent 3 months becoming the most significant presence in her daily life. What she saw on his face was something she would replay many times afterward in her memory, a stillness that moved through various shades of emotion in rapid succession: shock, calculation, recognition, anger, the sequence of a man who was putting pieces together in real time. "Caldwell," he said finally. "You said the name Caldwell." "Yes." "Do you know who that is?" "Gerald Caldwell," he said. "He's been buying up land options in the valley for the past year, small parcels here and there, the kind of purchases that don't mean anything on their own." He turned and looked out over his ranch. "They mean something together, though, don't they?" "They mean they've been building toward this for a long time," Alma said, "and my survey was the final piece." He was quiet for a long time. Then he turned back to her, and the expression on his face was something she could only describe as a man taking a full accounting of a serious situation. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Not, "What are you going to do?" Not, "Here is what needs to happen." He asked her what she wanted to do, which acknowledged that this was her situation, her commission, her professional life, her decision. She felt something crack open in her chest at that. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I need to think, and I needed to tell you first." He nodded. "Come inside," he said. "Breakfast is on." They sat in his kitchen, a large, spare, clean room with a cast iron stove and a table that had been made from timber he told her he'd cut himself, and they drank strong coffee and talked through it for 2 hours. What she knew, what she suspected, what could be proven and what couldn't. She had been so focused on the professional betrayal, on the way her technical skills had been weaponized without her knowledge, that she hadn't yet fully reckoned with the personal dimension of it. But sitting in Benjamin Underwood's kitchen, watching him think through the implications with the serious, systematic attention he brought to everything, she felt the personal dimension land very solidly. His ranch was in the right Hoveway corridor. She knew that from her own maps. The Underwood ranch house, the barns, the pasture land, the creek with its disputed water rights, all of it sat directly in the path the Pacific Southern would need to run their line through the valley if they filed the federal claim using her survey data. "They'll take the ranch," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in more ways than she could enumerate. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "You didn't know," he said. "I should have asked better questions before I came." "Maybe," he said. "But you're asking them now." She stared into her coffee. "The maps are almost complete. 3 more months and the survey will be finishable. If I complete it and submit it, Prout has everything he needs. If I don't complete it," she trailed off. "If you don't complete it," he said slowly, "they'll send someone else." "Yes," she said, "someone who won't have found out or who will know and not care." He was quiet, then he said, "What if the map told the truth but not the truth they want?" She looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "A survey is only as useful as what it includes," he said carefully. "You've been documenting land parcels and water rights. But what about the things that make a railroad claim legally complicated? Existing deeds, prior homestead filings, water rights that predate federal land grant authority." He leaned forward slightly. "What if the complete map made it very clear that this valley is already occupied, legally and legitimately, in ways that would make a federal railroad claim legally untenable?" Alma sat very still. What he was describing was not fraud. It was not the falsification of data. It was the completion of a genuinely comprehensive survey, rather than the deliberately incomplete one that Prout had wanted, one that documented all the legally relevant information, including the extensive prior claims and established rights that would create insurmountable legal complications for the Pacific Southern's land grant application. That would require me to go back and document every deed and homestead filing in the valley, she said, every water right registration, every prior claim. Yes, he said, that's months of additional work. Yes, he said again, I would have to approach every landholder in the valley individually. I know most of them, he said. I can make the introductions. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and it made the room feel very real and very immediate, every surface and shadow precisely itself, the way the world sometimes looks when you are paying absolute attention. Benjamin, she said, why are you helping me with this? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was careful and honest and somewhat startled by its own honesty, because I believe in what you're doing, the actual version of it, and because, he paused, because I don't want you to be the person whose work destroyed this valley. You deserve better than that. She thought about Caroline's tomato garden, about 3 years of trying before anything grew. All right, she said, let's do it. What followed was the most intensive 3 months of Alma's professional life, and also, she would reflect later, the most alive she had ever felt. They began with the ranch owners on the eastern slope, where Benjamin knew the families well. The McAllen brothers, who ran 700 head of cattle across land they had homesteaded under the 1862 Homestead Act, with the filing documents to prove it. Old Thomas Avery, who had been in the valley since 1865 and had a water rights registration that predated the Territorial Survey Office itself. The Ray's family, who had been on their land since before Colorado was even a territory, whose Spanish land grant claim was arguably the strongest legal instrument in the entire valley. Each family received them with varying degrees of suspicion and openness. Some were immediately cooperative when Benjamin explained the situation. Others needed to be persuaded, which meant being shown the evidence of what the Pacific Southern Consortium was planning, maps of their intended rail corridor that Alma had reconstructed from the land option purchases Margaret Finch had helped her track down. She watched Benjamin with these families. She watched the way he moved through the social landscape of the valley, not with authority exactly, but with something more durable, which was trust that had been built over years of being a reliable neighbor. He was the person who had helped get the McAllen brothers' cattle to market when one of them broke his leg. He was the person who had lent Avery his draft horse when Avery's died in the winter of 1876. He was the person who had quietly helped the Ray's family draft a letter to the county recorder 3 years ago when a bureaucratic error threatened their deed. He had been building something in this valley for 6 years, she realized. Not just a ranch, a network of genuine mutual obligation and care. It was an extraordinary thing to watch. And the more she watched it, the harder it became to pretend to herself that what she felt for Benjamin Underwood was purely professional appreciation, or intellectual regard, or even simple friendship. The problem was that she was terrified of it. She had not been in love since a brief and painful attachment in Washington 4 years ago that had ended when the young man in question had decided that a woman who intended to keep working after marriage was too complicated to deal with. She had built a careful life since then, a life organized around her work and her independence and the particular freedom that came from owing nothing to anyone. She had arrived in Harrow Valley alone and on purpose, and she had told herself that was how she preferred it. Benjamin had a way of making her wonder, quietly and persistently, whether she had been lying to herself. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late July when it first became impossible to pretend. They had spent the day documenting the Ray's family's land grant claims with the help of Maria Ray's, who was 23 years old, completely fluent in both Spanish and English, and possessed of an exceptionally precise memory for every legal detail of her family's land history. By the time they rode back toward the Underwood ranch in the cooling evening air, the day's light was going golden across the ridgelines, and the valley smelled of warm grass and late summer sage. They had been riding in comfortable silence for perhaps 20 minutes when Benjamin said, apparently addressing the horizon, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly if I'm overstepping." Alma felt the air change slightly around the conversation. "Go ahead," she said. "When this is done," he said, "when the survey is finished and the maps are complete and whatever happens with the Pacific Southern happens, what do you do next?" She had been thinking about this, in the way she thought about things she wasn't ready to think about, which was obliquely and late at night. "I go back to Washington," she said, "or I look for the next commission. There are surveys needed in New Mexico Territory, Arizona." "Is that what you want?" he asked. The question hung in the evening air. She looked at the valley spread out below them, the way the light was hitting the creek, the dark shapes of cattle in the far pasture, the small cluster of lights that was Harrow beginning to show against the darkening east, and she thought about how she had begun to know this landscape the way she knew the inside of her own head, the way she could look at the ridgeline and read the weather coming, the way she knew which section of the creek flooded in early spring, and which patch of ground on the upper pasture smelled of wild onion after rain. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest thing she could have said. He nodded slowly as if this was a sufficient answer for now, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. But at the gate of the ranch yard, when she turned her mare to head back toward Harrow, he said her name, and she stopped and turned. He had one hand on his horse's neck, and he was looking at her with that unguarded, direct attention of his, the look that had been undoing her steady patience for months. "I'm not trying to complicate things," he said. "I know you have a life that doesn't center here. I know what you came to do and what it cost you when you found out you'd been deceived. I'm not adding to that burden. He paused, and she saw something careful and vulnerable in his face. "I just want you to know that whatever you decide to do when this is over, I think this valley has been lucky to have you in it." It was not a declaration. It was not a confession. It was something quieter and more devastating than either of those things. It was a man being honest about what he felt while trying very hard not to ask for anything in return. Alma sat on her mare in the gate of the Underwood ranch yard in the fading light of a Colorado summer evening, and felt herself arrive at a decision she hadn't known she was already making. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes, I've been mapping this valley for 5 months," she said. "Every ridge and creek and parcel of land. I think I may have also," she started again. "I think I may have mapped some other things I didn't intend to." He was very still. "Your heart," she said clearly, because she was a woman who believed in precision, "is not going to be an easy thing to chart. I suspect it has unexplored territories and some rather complex topology. But I think," she took a breath, "I think I would very much like to try." The silence lasted exactly long enough for her to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Then Benjamin Underwood said, very quietly, "Alma," and she said, "Yes." And he stepped forward and reached up and put his hand over hers where it rested on the saddle horn, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was sufficient. The complication arrived in August, which was perhaps inevitable because the summer had been going too well. A man rode into Harrow on a black horse with a Pacific Southern Railroad Company badge on his coat, and his name was Gerald Caldwell, and he was precisely the sort of man who walked into every room as if he owned it, and was slightly irritated to discover he only owned most of it. Alma first encountered Caldwell at the Harrow General Store, where he was asking the proprietor pointed questions about the progress of the territorial survey, with the kind of casual authority that made it clear he already knew the answers and was testing whether the person he was asking would lie to him. She recognized him from Margaret's description: tall, expensively dressed for a frontier town, with a watch chain and a way of standing that suggested he expected everyone in his vicinity to be aware of how important he was. He spotted her as she was leaving with her supplies. His eyes went to the survey satchel on her shoulder. "Miss Yates," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent a cold spike of alertness through her. "Gerald Caldwell, Pacific Southern Railroad. I've been hoping to meet you." "I'm sure you have," she said pleasantly. He walked her back to her boarding house with the smooth, persistent friendliness of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through social pressure. He talked about the Pacific Southern's plans for the valley, framing them as progress, as inevitability, as the best possible outcome for everyone involved. He talked about the survey in terms that made it clear he considered it essentially complete and essentially his. "Director Prout tells me you're perhaps 3 months from submission," he said as they reached the boarding house steps. "Director Prout is optimistic," Alma said carefully. Caldwell smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Yates, I want to be direct with you. The Pacific Southern has invested considerably in this project. We're counting on the survey being completed according to the original scope and timeline." He paused. "There are careers that rise and fall on these kinds of projects. And the survey office has considerable influence over who receives future commissions." He had not threatened her, not technically. But the shape of a threat was clearly visible under the surface of what he'd said, the way a stone is visible under shallow water. "I appreciate your directness, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I intend to complete the survey fully and accurately. Good evening." She went inside and leaned against the closed door in the hallway and breathed very carefully. Margaret Finch appeared from the kitchen doorway with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the look of a woman who had seen this particular shape of trouble before. "That was Caldwell," she said. "Yes," Alma said. "What did he want?" "To remind me whose side I'm supposed to be on," Alma said. Margaret considered this. "He's been talking to some of the smaller landholders," she said, "offering to buy them out. Some of them are tempted. The offers are fair enough on the surface." "They wouldn't be fair once they understood what they'd be giving up," Alma said. "No," Margaret agreed. "But scared people take the fair surface and don't look under it." That night, Alma wrote a long letter to a lawyer in Denver named James Cortland, whose name she had been given by Thomas Avery as someone who had successfully challenged a similar land grant claim in the northern part of the territory 2 years ago. She described the situation in precise detail: the prior claims, the Homestead Act filings, the Spanish land grants, the water rights registrations, the full scope of what she had documented over the past months. She also rode out to Benjamin's ranch the next morning and told him about Caldwell. He was standing in the barn when she arrived, checking over a horse's leg with the focused attention of someone diagnosing a problem. When she finished telling him about the conversation, he straightened and looked at her steadily. "He's here because they're getting nervous," he said. "I think so," she said. "My survey is running long and they don't know why." "Caldwell tends to get more dangerous when he's nervous," Benjamin said. "He came through here about 1.5 years ago when he was making the first land option offers. One of the homesteaders on the southern end who turned him down had his well collapse 6 weeks later. Probably a coincidence." "Probably," Alma agreed in the tone of voice that meant nothing of the sort. "I don't want you writing the outlying sections alone for a while," he said. "I'm not going to stop working," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to, I'm asking you not to do it alone." He met her eyes. "Please." The please was enough, she agreed. September brought 2 things: the completion of the comprehensive survey documents and the arrival of James Cortland from Denver. The lawyer was a small, precise man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of meticulous, unhurried intelligence that Alma recognized from the best surveyors she had worked with. He reviewed her documentation over 3 days at the boarding house, cross-referencing her survey maps against the deed filings and homestead registrations she had gathered, making notes in a small leather book with a dedication that she found immediately impressive. "This," he said on the second day, tapping the compiled survey package, "is one of the most thorough collections of prior claim evidence I have ever seen. The Spanish land grant alone creates a legal barrier to the federal railroad land grant application that I would back in any territorial court in the country." Benjamin was present for that conversation, sitting at Margaret Finch's kitchen table with his hat on his knee. And when Cortland said those words, Alma watched something happen in his expression, not quite relief, because the tension was still there, but the first sign that the tension might eventually have somewhere to go. Cortland filed an injunction application with the territorial court in Denver within the week, citing the comprehensive survey documentation as evidence that the Pacific Southern's pending land grant claim was legally untenable given the extensive prior legal interests throughout the valley. Caldwell's reaction was swift. He came to the boarding house the morning after the injunction filing was published in the territorial newspaper. Margaret Finch had a subscription, and he was no longer smooth and expensively friendly. He was cold, and the coldness was more honest. "You have made a significant error," he told Alma, standing in Margaret's parlor. "I completed a comprehensive survey," she said. "That's what I was commissioned to do." "You were commissioned to conduct a standard land and boundary survey," he said, "not to conduct a fishing expedition through deed records on behalf of ranching interests." "The deed records are part of the legal landscape of the valley," she said calmly. "A comprehensive survey documents the landscape as it actually exists." He stared at her for a long moment. "Director Pruitt will hear about this," he said. "I expect he will," she said. "I sent him a copy of the complete survey package yesterday, along with a full accounting of his brother-in-law's position on the Pacific Southern Board and the conflict of interest that represents." Caldwell went very still. Then he turned and walked out without another word. Margaret appeared in the doorway holding a broom. "Well," she said, "that went about as well as it could." "He's going to try something else," Alma said. "He is," Margaret agreed. "What are you going to do?" Alma looked at the stack of survey documents on the parlor table. The maps, the deed compilations, the water right registrations, all of it. The most comprehensive, honest, professionally precise work of her career. The thing she had come to the frontier to make, though she hadn't known it at the start. "Keep working," she said. What Caldwell did next was the thing she had been afraid of, though she had not been able to predict the precise form it would take. He burned the maps. Not the originals, those were safely in Cortland's possession in Denver. But she had a full set of working copies in the ranch house, where she had been using Benjamin's large oak table as her drafting surface for the final assembly of the survey package. And one evening in late September, while she was in Harrow and Benjamin was out checking the far pasture fences, someone got into the ranch house and set fire to the working copies in the fireplace. It was Everett who found it, when he came back from checking on the horses and saw the smoke from the chimney at an hour when no one should have been in the house. He got the fire out quickly enough that the house itself wasn't damaged, but the map copies were reduced to the charred fragments that Alma came back to find: the burning edges, the blackened paper, the destruction of something she had spent months creating. And it was there, standing in the ranch house with the ruined maps in her hands, that she had the full and devastating conversation with Benjamin that had begun this story. She stood there with the charred edges of her work copies between her fingers, and she said, "You knew." And he said, "I found out 3 weeks ago." The silence between them in that moment was the worst kind, not hostile, not cold, but full of hurt and confusion, and the specific ache of two people who have become deeply important to each other discovering that importance tested in an unexpected and painful way. "3 weeks ago," she said. Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. "You knew 3 weeks ago that Caldwell had someone inside, someone who had access to your property, and you didn't tell me." "I didn't know for certain," he said. He had moved to the center of the room now, not toward her but not away either, occupying the space between them with an honest kind of desperation. "I suspected. I'd noticed things: a door left differently than I'd left it, a section of fence that had been walked when it shouldn't have been. I started watching." But I didn't have proof, and I didn't want to alarm you before I had something concrete. You should have told me, she said. Benjamin, I had a right to know. Yes, he said immediately. You're right. I should have told you. I was trying to protect you and I made a bad decision. I'm sorry. There was no qualification in it, no defensive deflection, just an acknowledgement, clear and immediate, that he had been wrong. Alma stood very still for a long moment. Then she set the charred map pieces down on the table. The originals are in Denver with Cortland, she said. Caldwell's man burned copies. The damage is professional frustration, not legal catastrophe. I know, he said. But it wasn't, he stopped. It wasn't about the maps. I was afraid. I was afraid that if I told you how serious the physical danger was, you would leave. Pack up and go to Denver or back to Philadelphia or wherever the next commission was. And he exhaled. I was not ready for you to leave. The room was very quiet. Alma Yates looked at Benjamin Underwood across the scarred oak table and the burned remnants of her working maps, and she thought about all the things she had been building since March, the professional work. Yes, but also this other thing, this complicated and unexpected and deeply real attachment to a man who listened to her, and challenged her, and made her coffee in the morning, and rode with her across the ridgelines, and looked at the land with the same kind of attentive reverence she brought to the task of recording it. She thought about the fact that she had woken up 3 mornings this week thinking about what he might say about whatever she was working on that day, which was, she recognized, the surest sign she knew of that she was genuinely in love with someone. I'm not leaving, she said. He went very still. I mean, she said, with as much composure as she could manage, I am angry with you, and we are going to have a much more thorough conversation about this decision-making of yours. And I need you to understand that I require honesty, full and complete honesty, as a non-negotiable condition of everything. But I am not leaving. Alma. I'm not leaving, she said again, more firmly, as if the repetition might anchor the statement in reality and keep her own fear from pulling it loose. I came to this valley to make a map, and I have made something considerably more complicated than a map, and I am not leaving it behind. Benjamin Underwood crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face between his hands and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and so direct and so full that she felt it in the back of her knees. I love you, he said. I have been trying to find the right moment to say that for 2 months, and I have handled this entire situation badly, and I love you. I know, she said, which was true. I love you too, and you still should have told me about Caldwell's man. I know, he said. Promise me, she said. I promise, he said. And then he kissed her and she kissed him back, and the burned maps on the table behind her became immediately a great deal less important. The legal proceedings moved through the autumn with the grinding momentum of territorial jurisprudence. Cortland argued the injunction before the territorial court in Denver in October, presenting Alma's comprehensive survey documentation as the primary evidence. The case attracted attention in the territorial newspaper and eventually in papers as far as Kansas City, which was reporting on the growing conflict between railroad expansion interests and established frontier landholders throughout the West. Alma traveled to Denver to provide testimony in October, which was the first time she had left Harrow Valley since March, and which felt profoundly disorienting. The city was loud and close, and the air smelled of coal smoke and horse, and the sky above the streets was only a narrow strip, rather than the enormous, theatrical expanse she had grown accustomed to. Benjamin rode with her to the stage stop, which was 15 miles from the ranch, and they stood in the early morning cold while the stage was being readied, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her in the way he had of looking at things he needed to fully understand. Cortland thinks the injunction will hold, she said. I know, he said. Come back. I'm coming back, she said. I know that too, he said. I just needed to say it. She had thought about that for the whole 10 hours on the stage to Denver, the difference between knowing something and needing to say it anyway. The way some truths needed to be spoken to be real, the way a boundary on a map didn't become an official boundary until someone named it. Denver was overwhelming and productive in roughly equal measure. Cortland's presentation of her survey work was precise and compelling. She testified for most of a day, describing her methodology, the legal documents she had examined, the comprehensive nature of the prior claims she had documented. Under cross-examination by the Pacific Southern's attorney, an expensive man from back east who clearly found the whole business of frontier law tiresome, she remained calm, precise, and completely unshakable, which she attributed to years of practice defending her professional conclusions in rooms full of skeptical men. The judge issued a preliminary ruling in favor of the injunction before she left Denver. She rode back into Harrow Valley on a Thursday in late October with the preliminary ruling in her satchel and the mountain air sharp with the first hints of coming winter, and Benjamin met her at the road to the ranch on horseback and looked at her face and said simply, "We won." "Preliminarily," she said. "The full hearing is in January." "But we won preliminarily," he said. "Yes," she said, and smiled, and felt the cold air and the familiar smell of the valley and the particular quality of the light at that hour settle around her like something she recognized as home. They rode back to the ranch together, and Everett had apparently been informed of her return, because there was a pot of elk stew on the stove and a fire in the hearth, and the three of them ate together in the comfortable, easy way of people who have navigated something serious together and come out on the other side with their regard for each other intact. Caldwell left the valley in November, when the Pacific Southern's board of directors, faced with the legal complications and the territorial press coverage, quietly suspended the Harrow Valley right-of-way application pending the January hearing. Margaret Finch heard from her Denver contacts that Director Pruitt had been asked to resign from the Territorial Survey Office, citing the conflict of interest that Alma had documented in her letter to him. Whether he did so voluntarily or under pressure was a matter of some local speculation, but the outcome was the same. The valley, for the moment, was safe. But something had happened to Alma during those months that she was still in the process of fully understanding, and it was this. She had arrived in Harrow Valley believing that she was someone whose life was organized around the next survey, the next commission, the next map to be made. She had believed, with the conviction of someone who has constructed their identity very deliberately around a certain way of living, that she was a professional first and that everything else was supplementary. What she had discovered was that this was not quite true. Or rather, it was true but incomplete, the way a map is true but always incomplete because the world is more complex than any document can fully capture. She was a cartographer. She always would be. But she was also a person who loved the way Benjamin's hands looked when he was working, who had a standing argument with him about the proper technique for reading cloud formations as weather indicators that had been going on since August and showed no signs of resolution, who had learned the names of all his horses and had opinions about their relative temperaments, and who had spent a great deal of time lately thinking about the kitchen garden behind the ranch house and what she might plant in it in the spring. In November, she moved her belongings from Margaret Finch's boarding house to the Underwood Ranch. This was not done without ceremony. Margaret made them both sit in her parlor and delivered a 20-minute address on the subject of mutual respect, honest communication, and the importance of maintaining one's independent professional identity within a partnership, which was either extremely progressive for 1878 or simply very characteristic of Margaret Finch, depending on how well you knew her. Alma said, "Yes, Margaret," approximately 7 times during this address, and meant it every time. Benjamin said, "Yes, ma'am," approximately 4 times and appeared to take detailed mental notes. The winter settled over Harrow Valley with the serene brutality that Colorado winters specialized in, and Alma found herself inhabiting a completely different relationship with the landscape than she had when she'd arrived in March. She had mapped it from the outside, from the professional distance of measurement and documentation. Now she was inside it, living with its storms and silences, and the particular quality of winter light that made the ridgelands look like they were drawn in charcoal against a white sky. She continued to work. She had written to the Territorial Survey Office, under its new interim director, who had been appointed specifically to address the Prout situation, proposing a continued engagement to complete additional survey work in the Southern Valley districts that had been outside her original commission. The interim director had accepted, so she was still employed, still surveying, still building the record of this part of the world that would outlast all of them. She also spent a significant amount of the winter in conversation with Benjamin about the ranch, not planning exactly, but the kind of sustained dialogue about the future that people have when they have decided they are building it together. He wanted to expand the herd, which required better water management on the upper pasture. She had ideas about that, derived from her survey work on the valley's hydrology, that he found immediately useful. He had thoughts about the western fence line that were based on years of watching the cattle and the weather, which she found she was incorporating unconsciously into her mental map of the property. It was, she thought, a very specific kind of collaboration, and she loved it. The January hearing in Denver went well. Cortland presented the full case with the comprehensive survey documentation, and the Territorial Court issued a permanent ruling in February. The Pacific Southern Railroad's land grant application for the Harrow Valley right-of-way was denied on the grounds of extensive prior legal claims and established property rights throughout the proposed corridor. The ruling cited Alma's survey work by name as the authoritative documentation of the valley's land status. The news reached Harrow by telegraph on a cold February Tuesday, and Margaret Finch organized what she called a modest gathering at the boarding house that turned out to be attended by approximately 35 of the valley's 43 residents, which given the weather was an extraordinary turnout. Thomas Avery, who was not a man given to public declarations, stood up at some point during the evening and raised a glass of whiskey and said that the valley owed Alma Yates more than it could repay, and they all knew it. And the room had agreed with more feeling than Alma had been prepared for, and she had been obliged to press her lips together very firmly and look at the ceiling for a moment. Benjamin, standing beside her, had quietly taken her hand. Later, when the gathering had wound down and they were walking back through the dark and cold to the ranch, she said, "You could have told me you were proud of me. You didn't have to do it through Thomas Avery." "I didn't tell Thomas Avery to say that," he said. "No, but it was more or less what you've been thinking." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "More than that." She looked at him. The cold was severe enough that their breath made small clouds in the dark, and the stars over the valley were extraordinary in the way they always were on clear winter nights, thick and dense and overwhelming. "More than that," she said carefully. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that there is no right answer. The answer is whatever is true for you, and I will take it as it comes." "Benjamin," she said. "Alma," he said. "Will you marry me?" The cold air, the stars, the valley around them mapped and known, and hers in every way that mattered. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without qualification, without anything except the clean, unambiguous truth of it. He exhaled, the long release of a breath that had been held for what felt like a very long time, and reached for her, and she stepped into him, and they stood in the dark Colorado winter at the edge of the road to the ranch that was becoming her ranch too, and held each other for a long time in the silence. They were married in April, when the valley was beginning its annual argument with winter about whether spring had arrived yet. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit minister who came through Harrow every 6 weeks, and it was attended by Margaret Finch, Thomas Avery, the McAllen brothers, the Ray's family, Everett, and approximately 20 other residents of the valley who appeared to feel a personal investment in the outcome. Maria Ray's served as Alma's attendant and looked beautiful in a blue dress, and had strong opinions about the proper arrangement of Alma's hair that she expressed without asking permission, which Alma found she didn't mind at all. The ceremony was brief and completely sincere. When the minister asked if she took this man, she said yes with the same clean directness she brought to all the important things, and saw something in Benjamin's eyes at that moment that she intended to spend the rest of her life being worthy of. The reception, such as it was, involved Margaret Finch's cooking and Thomas Avery's whiskey, and a fiddle player from the McAllen Ranch who was considerably better than anyone had expected. And at some point in the evening, Alma found herself standing in the doorway of Margaret's boarding house looking out over Harrow. The small collection of buildings, the dirt road, the vast dark sky above it all, and feeling the particular satisfaction of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended to go. Even if the route was nothing like what they'd planned, Margaret appeared beside her as she had a way of doing. "Well," Margaret said. "Well," Alma agreed. "This isn't what you came here for," Margaret said. "No," Alma said. "It's better." Margaret made a noise that was either agreement or satisfaction or both, and they stood there together in the doorway for a moment in the easy silence of women who understand each other. The spring and summer that followed were the most comprehensively alive period of Alma's life, which she documented in the back of her field notebooks with the same precision she brought to her survey work, a private accounting of the particular texture of each day, the ongoing measurements of a life that was larger and more varied and more full than the one she had been living in March of the previous year. She completed the Southern Valley Survey by June, which the Territorial Survey Office accepted with considerable relief, given the legal significance of her earlier work. She was offered a permanent position with the Denver office, which she negotiated down to a contract arrangement that would allow her to take commissions without being required to relocate. The interim director, who understood political realities, agreed without argument. Benjamin expanded the herd by 120 head over the summer, which required every person on the ranch to work very hard for several months, including Alma, who did not have a particular talent for cattle management, but had extremely good spatial awareness and an ability to read terrain that turned out to be surprisingly applicable to organizing livestock movement patterns across large distances. Benjamin found this both impressive and extremely funny and said so several times. She planted the kitchen garden in late April with the same determination she brought to everything. The soil was alkaline and difficult, and the spring weather was uncooperative. She replanted twice. In August, she harvested tomatoes, not many but some, and brought them to the supper table with a satisfaction that Benjamin recognized immediately and met with a look of such warmth and understanding that she nearly couldn't eat. In September of 1879, she told him she was pregnant. He sat very still for a moment, the way he sat still with important information, taking the full measure of it. Then he looked at her with an expression that she could not have described on a map if she had tried. It was joy and terror and love, and all simultaneously, the face of someone who is realizing that the world has grown to contain more than they knew how to account for. "Are you?" he started. "I'm well," she said immediately because she knew what he was asking. "I'm completely well, I'm not frightened." A pause. "Well, I'm somewhat frightened." "Me too," he said. "I know," she said. "We're going to be fine." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Yes," he said, "we are." The pregnancy was, as pregnancies in the Colorado Territory in 1879 tended to be, a matter of considerable pragmatism. Dr. Horace Fenn, who served the valley out of an office above the Harrow General Store, was a capable and unsentimental man who had delivered approximately 40 babies and had strong views about rest and nutrition that Alma took seriously while continuing to work at her drafting table, which was a compromise position that Dr. Fenn accepted as the best available option. Margaret Finch came to the ranch in October and stayed through the winter in the role of, she made it clear, not a nurse or a cook, but a friend who happened to have opinions about everything. This arrangement worked perfectly. There were cold evenings by the fire when Alma would be drafting and Benjamin would be reading one of the agricultural journals he subscribed to, and Margaret would be knitting with the efficiency of someone who viewed idle hands with deep suspicion. And the ranch house would be very warm and very quiet in the specific way of places where people are at home. On those evenings, Alma would sometimes look up from her drafting and take a slow account of what was around her. The fire, the lamplight, Benjamin's profile as he read, the sound of the wind outside the thick walls of the house he had built with his own hands, and she would feel something that she had no precise professional term for. Something that was the opposite of the wide, searching restlessness she had felt for most of her adult life. Not the absence of motion, just the presence of a particular kind of rightness, the sense of being accurately located. The baby arrived in March of 1880, exactly 2 years after Alma had first stepped off the stagecoach in Harrow Valley with her leather satchel full of instruments, and her commission letter from a man who had been planning to use her skills to destroy everything around her. He was a boy robust and opinionated, as Margaret put it, from the very first hour, and they named him James, after Alma's father, the navigator who had taught her to read charts before she could read words. Benjamin held him in the first hour with the careful, astonished concentration of a man learning to read a new language, and Alma watched him from the bed, and thought that she had spent her life building documents that told the truth about the world, and that this was the truest thing she had ever had a hand in making. James Underwood turned out to be, in his first months of life, a person of strong preferences and considerable communicative ability, none of which required words. He had Benjamin's eyes and Alma's stubbornness, and Margaret Finch's capacity for expressing displeasure, which Margaret said she found flattering. By the summer of 1880, the Underwood ranch had expanded again. Everett had taken on 2 additional hands brothers named Santos and Lewis, newly arrived from New Mexico Territory, and the operation had settled into the productive rhythm of a well-run enterprise that knew what it was doing and had the people to do it. Alma completed 2 more survey commissions that year, both within a day's ride of the ranch, which allowed her to work without extended absences. She had developed a professional reputation in the territory that was somewhat unusual. A female cartographer whose survey work had been instrumental in defeating a major railroad land grab was not the kind of person the territorial courts or the survey office could afford to treat dismissively, regardless of whatever private opinions individual officials might have held. She found the professional respect useful and the underlying condescension unsurprising and entirely irrelevant. Thomas Avery died in the winter of 1880, peacefully, in his sleep, which was the best available outcome for a man of 72 who had been in the valley since 1865 and had outlasted every prediction anyone had made about him. The valley mourned him quietly and thoroughly. He had left his land to his nephew, who arrived from Ohio in the spring, and proved to be as steady and decent as his uncle had been, which was a considerable relief. The Ray's family, Maria and her parents and her 3 brothers, remained the anchor of the valley's southern end. Maria had begun teaching at the small school that had been established in Harrow in 1879, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done with her precision, patience, and comprehensive knowledge of 2 languages. She and Alma had developed a friendship that had its own vocabulary, and its own running arguments, and its own deep mutual regard, the kind of friendship that 2 women build when they've been on the same side of a serious fight, and have both come out of it knowing who they are. In the spring of 1881, Alma found herself standing at the top of the eastern ridge above the Underwood Ranch, the same ridge where she had first set a survey marker 3 years ago, the same place where she had first taken a bearing with her Brunton compass, and turned to find Benjamin Underwood watching her with the expression of a man who had encountered something the landscape hadn't prepared him for. The valley spread below her in the April light, the creek catching the sun, the ranch house and barns clear and precise in the morning air, the cattle moving in the far pasture, the mountains beyond everything, enormous and permanent and completely indifferent to all human activity in their shadow. She had her field notebook and her compass, because she was conducting a preliminary assessment for a new commission in the southern districts. She had James strapped in a carrier across her back, which was a practical arrangement that Dr. Fenn had not specifically authorized but had also not specifically prohibited, and which James had expressed his opinion of by going immediately to sleep when the horse started moving. And she had the maps, all the maps, the ones in her head that she had been building since March of 1878, the comprehensive and constantly updating record of this valley, its geography and its history and its people and its future. She thought about the charred fragments on the oak table, about how she had held the burned edges of her work, and thought she understood what it felt like to have something destroyed. About how she had been wrong about that, because the originals had been safe in Denver, and the real map, the one that couldn't be burned, was the one she had been building inside herself all along. She heard hoofbeats below her on the slope and turned, knowing before she turned who it would be. Benjamin was riding up the ridge path with the unhurried ease that was so entirely characteristic of him that it had become, over 3 years, one of the primary ways she oriented herself in the world. He had James's favorite blanket draped over the saddlebag, because he was the kind of man who thought to bring the blanket even when it seemed unnecessary. He dismounted and came to stand beside her at the ridge crest and looked out over the valley the way she had been looking at it, and they were quiet together in the way of people who have learned to occupy the same silence without filling it. "The survey assessor is coming next week," she said eventually, "for the Southern District Review." "I know," he said. "I thought you might need someone to watch James while you're in the field." "I might," she said, "or I might take him with me again. He's been very helpful so far." Benjamin looked at the sleeping infant on her back with the expression he consistently wore around his son, a kind of wondering, amused, completely helpless love. "He slept through the whole survey. Every measurement," she said. "Either he finds cartography profoundly soothing or he has very good professional instincts and understands that you don't disturb the surveyor during a reading." Benjamin laughed, the real laugh, not the controlled one he used in public, the one that was entirely unguarded and that she had spent 3 years collecting like something precious. Probably both. She leaned her shoulder against his arm, and he turned and pressed a kiss to her temple, and they stood there on the ridge above the valley they had both, in different ways and at different times, decided to call home. "I was thinking," he said, in the careful way he introduced things he had been thinking about for a while. "Tell me," she said. "The eastern pasture land," he said. "If we brought the fence line out another half-mile toward the ridge, we'd have access to the spring-fed section that only runs in wet years. It might be worth documenting for a water rights filing." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her with that particular expression, slightly expectant, slightly amused, that she had come to understand as his version of knowing exactly what he was doing. "You want me to map your water rights," she said. "I thought," he said, "that you had expressed an interest in mapping complicated topographies." "I said your heart would require extensive mapping," she said. "I didn't necessarily intend to extend the commission indefinitely." "No," he said. She looked at him, at the valley below, at the mountains on the horizon that she had come to know as well as she knew the lines of his face, every angle, every variation of light and shadow, every condition. "Yes," she said. "All right, I'll map your water rights." He smiled, and then, she said, "I expect there will be something else." James made a small sound from the carrier, the pre-waking noise he made when he was about to decide that sleep was no longer the point. They both looked at him, the tiny face, the perfect precision of him, the small extraordinary fact of his existence. "He's going to want feeding soon," Benjamin said. "He always wants feeding," Alma said. "He's a Underwood. You all have strong opinions about meals." Benjamin shook his head with the tolerant affection of a man who has accepted that the person he loves is going to continue being precisely who they are and has decided this is entirely to his benefit. "We should go down," he said. "In a minute," she said. She took one more slow look at the valley below, the whole complicated, beloved, well-documented truth of it. The creek she had measured in her third week here. The ridge she had first stood on with a compass and a question. The ranch that had become her life's fixed point, the anchor from which she took all her bearings. She thought about what she had mapped and what had mapped her in return. "All right," she said. "Let's go home." They rode down the ridge together in the April light, the valley opening around them as they descended, and the mountains stood at the horizon in the permanent way of things that have been there longer than memory. And the ranch appeared at the bottom of the slope, with the familiar geometry of a place that knows it is loved and has settled into the certainty of it. James woke up when they reached the yard and announced his opinion of the situation with considerable force, and Benjamin took him with the practiced ease of someone who has discovered he is very good at something he hadn't previously known he would be good at. And Alma unsaddled Agnes and handed the reins to Everett and walked into the house and started the fire and put water on for coffee and felt the morning settle around her like something complete. It was 1881. The valley was safe, and the maps were accurate, and the law had held, and the man she loved was in the yard with their son, and the mountains to the west were exactly where they had always been. She got her field notebook from the table and wrote the date and the conditions and the first observations of the morning, because she was a cartographer, and that was what she did. She made records of the world as it was, precisely and honestly, so that what was true could be known and kept. And what was true, on this particular morning in the Colorado Territory in the spring of 1881, was everything that she would have been unable to imagine in March of 1878, when a laconic stagecoach driver named Pete had put her trunk down in the road and pointed at a collection of 43 souls in a wide valley between the sandstone ridges and the distant mountains. What was true was the ranch and the valley and the maps and the law and the friends and the neighbors and the garden, which this year she was planting with tomatoes and also beans, and a reckless optimism about winter squash that everyone except Maria had expressed doubts about. What was true was James. What was true was Benjamin coming through the door with the baby on one arm and his hat in his hand, saying, "He's fine." He was just announcing himself, which was his standard phrase for every occasion when James had opinions about the state of the world, which was all occasions. What was true was this, the precise, actual, documented truth of where she was and what she had built, and what had been built around her, and in her and because of her. She had come to the frontier as a cartographer, and somewhere along the way, over the ridgelines and through the legal hearings and across the burned maps and the cold winters and the spring planting and the conversations that lasted until the fire died down, the rancher had mapped something that no instrument she owned could have measured. He had mapped the exact coordinates of the place she belonged, and the survey was, at last, complete. Except that it wasn't, of course, because the world kept being made and remade. And in 1882, she accepted a commission in the high country above the valley and spent 3 weeks in the mountains, and came home with notebooks full of new observations and a quiet certainty about a second child, confirmed by Dr. Fenn in October with his customary efficiency. This one was a girl born in April of 1883, red-faced and absolutely certain of her own importance from the very first moment. And they named her Caroline after the woman Benjamin had loved first and lost too young, who had planted tomatoes in Colorado soil and deserved to be remembered. Caroline Underwood had her mother's stubbornness and her father's eyes and the particular frontier confidence of a child who grows up understanding that the world is both vast and knowable, that it can be measured and mapped, and that the measuring and mapping are acts of love as much as science. James was 3 years old when his sister arrived, and had already developed a serious interest in horses and a somewhat alarming ability to pick locks, which Benjamin said came from his side of the family, and which Alma declined to investigate. The valley changed and didn't change over the years that followed. in the way that good places do, the same water, the same ridgelines, the same enormous sky, but layered over time with all the specific events and people and decisions that make a place a history. The McAllen brothers sold out in 1884 to a family from Missouri named Whitmore who proved to be decent neighbors. A second school was established in the western end of the valley in 1885. The telegraph line was extended through Harrow in 1886, which Margaret Finch pronounced an improvement, and Thomas Avery would have had opinions about, had he been there to express them. Maria Reyes was married in 1884 to a man named Raphael Domings who had come to the valley from Taos, and who was the most patient person Alma had ever met, which everyone agreed was precisely what Maria needed, and which Maria disputed vigorously and happily. They had 2 children within 3 years, and Maria continued to teach school with the same precision and absolute refusal to accept less than the best from her students. Margaret Finch remained at her boarding house until she decided, in 1886, to close it. She moved into a small house in Harrow that Benjamin and the ranch hands helped build, and she sat on her porch in the evenings and watched the valley with the satisfied expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know when things have come out right. The Pacific Southern Railroad did, eventually, run a line through Colorado Territory, but not through Harrow Valley. The legal precedent established by Cortland's case had made the valley an unattractive target, and the railroad had found another route through the mountains further north. The line, when it was completed in 1887, was useful for getting cattle to Denver and Kansas City, and the valley's ranchers, including Benjamin, used it, which was either ironic or practical depending on how you thought about it. Alma thought it was practical. She had nothing against railroads as a technology. She had something against the fraudulent weaponization of cartographic work against the people it was supposed to serve, which was a different thing entirely. She went on surveying. The Colorado Territory became Colorado State in 1876, and the state's need for comprehensive cartographic documentation only grew through the years. She built a reputation that was eventually, necessarily, impossible to dismiss. The survey work was too precise, the legal outcomes too significant, the record too long. By the late 1880s, she was receiving commissions from the federal government as well as the state, and she trained 2 apprentices, one of whom was a young man from Pueblo, and one of whom was Maria Reyes's oldest student, a 16-year-old girl who had announced her intention to be a cartographer with a certainty that Alma found entirely sympathetic. She was 36 years old in 1887 when the federal commission came in from the Department of the Interior, offering her the lead cartographic role in a comprehensive survey of the entire southwestern territory from Colorado through New Mexico. It was the largest commission of her career. It would require 2 years of field work and extensive travel. She sat with it for a week, turning it over the way she turned over any complex measurement, taking it from different angles and in different lights. Then she talked to Benjamin. They were in the kitchen, always the kitchen, which had become their real office as much as any desk, and she spread the commission letter on the table and watched him read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up. "This is what you've been working toward," he said. "It's a significant commission," she said. "No," he said. "I mean this is what you have been working toward, since you were 20 years old, learning to survey from your father. This is the scale of work you were built to do." She felt the truth of that and also the complication of it. "The children," she said. "James is 7, he said. Caroline is 4. They have me and they have Everett and they have Margaret around the corner and they will be fine. And they will have you because you are their mother and you are not disappearing, you are working." She looked at him. 2 years is a long time." "It is," he said. "I'll miss you every day." "Benjamin, Alma," he said quietly. "I knew who you were when I fell in love with you. I knew what kind of life you were built to live. I have never wanted to be the thing that kept you smaller than you are. That's not love. That's just," he paused, "that's just fear with better intentions." She stared at the commission letter, at his hands on the table. "I won't be gone the whole 2 years," she said. "There will be intervals between survey sections. I can come home." "I know," he said, "and I want to train someone to run the southern sections independently so I can concentrate on the high country work," she said. "That will mean I'm within reasonable distance more often." "That's sensible," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I'm sure," he said. "Go make the map." She accepted the commission in October of 1887. She spent the winter preparing, organizing her equipment, reviewing every existing survey document for the Southwestern Territory, making arrangements for the ranch and for the children, and for the 100 practical necessities of an extended professional engagement. She left in March of 1888, 10 years exactly after she had first arrived in the territory, on a morning that was cold and clear and very bright. The whole family came to the stage stop, James and Caroline and Benjamin and Everett and Margaret, who had gotten herself a horse and buggy for the occasion, and Maria Reyes and her husband and their children, and several other people from the valley who had heard she was leaving and came to see her off in the way that communities turn out for their own. She embraced Margaret, who said only, "Come home," and pressed her lips together very firmly. She crouched down and held James, who was trying very hard to be composed about it and was almost succeeding, and told him that he was in charge of the kitchen garden while she was gone, and that she expected detailed reports. He nodded seriously. She held Caroline, who was 4 years old and had inherited every ounce of her grandmother's tomato-growing determination, and was not trying to be composed about anything because she was 4 and composure was for later. "Come back, Mama," she said with the absolute authority of a person who has not yet learned to hedge their demands. "I'm coming back," Alma said. "I promise." Then she stood up and looked at Benjamin. He was standing in the early morning light with the same expression he had worn the day he'd first found her on his ridge with her compass and her satchel, the baffled, attentive, completely unguarded look of a man who is encountering something that has exceeded his expectations. "I will write you from every stop on the survey," she said. "I know," he said, "and I will send back the preliminary maps so you can see the work." "I'd like that," he said. She took a step toward him, and he met her halfway, and they held each other in the stage stop road in front of everyone, which was fine because everyone there understood exactly what this was and respected it accordingly. "Map everything," he said against her hair, "and then come home and tell me what it looks like." She pulled back just far enough to look at his face. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since that first Tuesday on the creek. I just didn't have the professional vocabulary for it yet." He laughed, the real one, the unguarded one, the one that was entirely her favorite sound in the world. "Get on the stage, Alma." "I'm going," she said. She went. The 2 years were long and extraordinary and difficult, and magnificent in roughly equal measure. The Southwestern Survey took her through terrain that was unlike anything she had mapped before: the high desert, the canyon country, the mountain passes, the living history of a landscape that had been traveled and named and fought over for centuries before any American survey office had thought to send someone to document it. She wrote to Benjamin from every significant stop, as promised. The letters were long and detailed and contained sketches of the terrain she was working in and observations about the weather and the people she encountered, and the extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable details of the world that only appear when you are paying the kind of attention that professional cartography demands. He wrote back. His letters were shorter. He was not a man for whom words on paper came as naturally as words in person, but they were consistently what she needed, which was the particular truthfulness of someone who understood what was actually happening in the life she'd left behind and reported it honestly. James's garden had done well this summer. Caroline had declared her intention to be a lawyer, based on a conversation she'd had with Cortland during his visit. Everett's knee was giving him trouble, but he refused to slow down. The cattle were doing well. The mountains were the same. Always, somewhere near the end, a sentence that was quiet and complete. I'm waiting. She came home in the spring of 1890 to Harrow Valley on a clear May morning, and Benjamin was waiting at the road to the ranch because he knew her schedule, and because he was the kind of man who waited at the road. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, which was not safe and was completely true to character, and he caught her, and they stood in the road in the May light and held each other while the horse stood patiently waiting for someone to pay attention to it. "Well," she said into his shoulder. "Well," he said. "I mapped the whole thing," she said. "I know," he said. "I have the letters." "It was extraordinary," she said. "The canyon country particularly. There are features down there that will take a generation of cartographers to fully document." "I believe it," he said. She pulled back and looked at him, 10 years older than when she'd first met him. The same eyes, the same quality of attention, the same complete presence. "I'm home," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." James was 10 years old and extremely taller than she'd expected, which he seemed to find satisfying and she found startling. He walked her around the kitchen garden with the seriousness of a professional reporting on a significant undertaking. And the tomatoes were already in. And there were also beans and squash, and an experimental asparagus bed that he explained with the technical confidence of someone who had done considerable research. She thought about her father, the navigator, who had taught her to read charts before she could read words. "You did an excellent job," she told James, and meant it in more ways than he could yet understand. Caroline was 7, and had apparently decided during Alma's absence that her mother's return was going to be managed on Caroline's terms, which meant she arrived at the breakfast table the next morning with a list of questions that had clearly been accumulating for 2 years. They covered topics including, but not limited to, the depth of the Grand Canyon, the number of mountain ranges she had crossed, the accuracy of the claim that rattlesnakes were more dangerous than they looked, and whether Alma had brought her anything. She had brought her a piece of rose quartz from the New Mexico high country, which Caroline examined with the serious attention of someone who intends to understand exactly what she has been given. "Good," Caroline said, pocketing it with the finality of a judge closing a case. The spring settled around them. The ranch was the same and entirely different, the way places are after an absence, the same coordinates, different light. She spent the first week simply being home, which was not nothing. She walked the property with Benjamin in the evenings, relearning the topography of the life she had built here, taking new measurements of all the familiar things. The Federal Survey report, when it was published later that year, was cited as the most comprehensive cartographic record of the Southwestern Territory to date. The Secretary of the Interior wrote her a letter. The new director of the USGS in Washington, the organization she had left in frustration 8 years ago, wrote to ask if she would be interested in a formal senior appointment. She wrote back a polite and thorough decline, explaining that she had an ongoing state commission and private practice that she intended to continue, and that she was available for contracted survey engagements of the kind she had been undertaking for the past decade. She folded that letter and put it in her professional files with a satisfaction that was entirely uncomplicated. One evening in the late summer of 1890, she was sitting at the drafting table with the evening light coming through the window at the angle that made the work easy, finishing the final review of a small survey she had completed for a neighboring parcel, when Benjamin came in from the yard and set a cup of coffee beside her without interrupting, and went to sit by the fire with his agricultural journal. James was in the kitchen doing his arithmetic, which he did loudly, with opinions. Caroline was asleep already because she was 7 and had strong feelings about her sleep schedule which nobody had taught her. The fire crackled. The coffee was exactly right. Outside, the Colorado night was clear, and the stars over the valley were the same extraordinary, dense, overwhelming mass of light they had always been. Alma put down her pen and looked at the map she was finishing, the precise and accurate record of another small piece of this world, One more addition to the accumulated document of what existed here and what mattered. She thought about the cartographer she had been in March of 1878, arriving with her instruments and her commission and her carefully organized independence, and the life she had built since. The surveys and the legal battles and the burned maps and the court victories, and the 2 children, and the kitchen garden, and the apprentices, and the long letters from the canyon country, and the May morning homecoming, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days between. She thought about what it meant to map something truly, not just its boundaries and its measurements, but its character, its history, the living fact of what it was. She looked at Benjamin Underwood reading his journal by the fire, and she thought, I know where I am. She picked up her pen, and she finished the map.